This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Ideas Festival, April 29th to May 6th, online and in Seattle.
Some of the stump photos that I find the most fascinating are ones where, they put 20 or 30 or 40 people on a stump. And you see this crowd of young men, boys, women, just packed onto a stump.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Stephen Haig.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And of course, Mossback's Northwest is a fascinating look at the history of the most interesting place on Earth, and it is hosted by Knut Berger. Today, we're going to talk about tree stumps. If you haven't seen the video on tree stumps, when stumps went viral, take a moment right now and go to the show notes or the show page on crosscut.com and check it out. And we'll see you back here in a moment.
Known for its forests, the Northwest had appeal for its moderate climate and fertile lands. Indigenous people had been cultivating crops and game, with periodic burnings to promote the growth of berries, camas root, and oak prairies. But when settlers poured into the region, they were dazzled by the forests, which they fell upon to chop down, to build with, and for lumber to sell.
The Pacific Northwest has had many beautiful symbols. Salmon, the orca, our iconic mountains, even Sasquatch. But Knut, now you've found a new one, tree stumps. Why?
Why trees? Well, tree stumps are one of those things that we take for granted today. You might
But they get in everybody's way.
They get in everybody's way. And they did throughout the settlement period. Stumps were a really big deal. I got interested in them because, as a kid, I remember going on hikes and seeing these big old tree stumps with notches cut into them. And my father, who had been a logger at one point, explaining how they put the springboards in those notches so they could get high enough to be able to cut the tree down.
Because the trees were so enormous, a size that we can't even comprehend today, that the saws were not big enough to cut at the base. Right?
Yeah, that's right. The bases were two. You have something that was maybe 19 or 20 feet in diameter, and that's awful difficult to cut down with a single saw. And so they used a lot of different techniques. But it takes us back to the period of settlement where not just people who are in the timber business, but homesteaders and others are coming here. They're facing these dense forests, which the plus side is you could cut these trees down and build a log cabin and get your homestead going. The downside is you were often left with what they used to call stump farms, which is just land littered with massive tree stumps. And if you want to, put cattle in there, raise horses, have a dairy, whatever, you've got a problem. And so early on, there are lots of accounts of the travails of the stump farmers in how do you dig these things out of the ground? Do you blow them up? Do you chop them up? Do you get a couple of oxen and try to haul them out of the ground? And these are trees that are hundreds, if not 1,000 years old, and often very, very rooted in the ground. So in the 19th century, particularly after the mid-19th century, you have people, dealing with tree stumps is a big deal, a travail that many of the settlers go through, talk about, write about.
I'm guessing you're going to tell us about some innovative ways that people used or dealt with tree stumps. And some of them are very high. They're not a tree stump that you're going to trip over. Sometimes they're 10 feet high?
Oh yeah, some of these trees, they wouldn't begin cutting it down until maybe 10, 12 feet in the air, in some cases even higher. I've read references up to 20 feet in the air before it's narrow enough that you can cut it. And so you can imagine that a lot of wood is going to waste. a lot of wood is difficult to remove, or for a single person or even two people to whittle down. And one of the intriguing things to me is you begin to see stories in the late 19th century about people turning these things into something useful. So hollowing out a cedar tree and using it as a barn, or using it as a shed, using it as a pen for goats. If you can't blast it out of the ground, if it's too big to deal with, then is there some use you can make out of it? And in a weird way, around 1900, some people turned them into what we would now call an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. Some of these stumps were so big that either because of age and being somewhat hollow at the base, or you could go in and take a small hollow and carve it out, they began to use these for other purposes.
Houses?
So, houses, exactly, stump houses. And that's really a thing that got me interested in it, because I came across, this was years ago, I came across a photo of a family standing in front of a tree stump that had a window in it and a roof and a little chimney with smoke coming out. And it seemed to me like the perfect symbol for Mossback. I wrote a column called Mossback in Seattle Weekly, and the logo on the column was a little hand-colored image of a stump house.
Sounds very Hobbitville to me, perfect for the Northwest.
Well, it is. It's funny because I think one of the things that people began to capture, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, was the scale. The scale of timber here was mind-blowing to people from elsewhere. And of course, we think of the California redwoods and the sequoias, but, in the Pacific Northwest, in both British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, you had these, forests of massive old trees. And people began to take photographs of people posing with trees and tree stumps, and very popular were pictures of either the tree stumps being made into something like a home. There was a tree stump post office over in the Elwha country. People might use the cut stump. They would be so big you could put horses up there. You could put a dance floor up there. And so you see all these postcards and photographs of people posing with their stumps.
On top of the stumps.
On top of the stumps, in front of the stumps, in the gashes in the stumps where they're, cutting the tree down. There'll be a man lying in the cut, showing you how big it is. A 6-foot man can lie on his side and stare at the camera cheekily.
It reminds me of the old postcards that would spoof, the giant grapes, the giant cabbage, the giant fruits that came out of this garden of paradise.
Yeah, exactly. You still see that, in roadside shops. And it was always a way to sort of tout whatever was special about your region. So you'd see like a flat car with a giant potato on it, and you'd know, oh, I'm in Idaho, And here in the early 1900s, that was a picture of a stump house. Massive cedar stumps often had hollow or soft interiors at the base. Why let them go to waste? Why not carve out some space and move in?
How big? Let's get back to how big the timber industry was and how it evolved, how it grew from the 1870s, I suppose, is when it was really starting to produce.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the transformation from the frontier period, where you have individual settlers and families dealing with these great trees, to the beginning of the logging business, the timber business, the commercial generation of vast quantities of building material primarily. So in 1879, 160 million board feet of timber was shipped out of Washington. That was the amount that was produced here in Washington State from forests.
Sounds like a lot.
10 years later, it's 1 billion board feet. So you go from 160 million to 1 billion. 1919, 5 billion. Yeah, 1929, right before the Great Depression, 7.3 billion. So you can see that this thing is scaling up very quickly, and part of that is because the forests are beginning to be exploited on a large scale by industrial logging. And the one number that I found really striking was in 1910, 63% of those people bringing home a paycheck, a wage earner in Washington, 63% were in the timber industry.
That's a mammoth.
Yeah. So
number.
You think, we have people, how many people work at Boeing? How many people work in the tech industry? 1910, it was the timber business. And this was before it was fully industrialized. This is, when people are still using saws and axes and, maybe they have steam engines to help them haul the timber in and out. But it's still kind of, the lumber business old school.
Where's the documentation of this the visual? Who chronicled the timber industry? How can people see the scale of that activity?
Well, that's a great question because luckily, and you could also say unfortunately, because we look at these images in a different way than they were looked at in the 19th and early 20th century. But Darius Kinsey was a photographer who worked out of Sedro-Woolley. His wife Tabitha was a full partner in his photography business. And Kinsey took amazing photographs, large glass plate photographs of the logging industry at that time. And, what you see in those images are some of the pictures I'm talking about. People posing with trees, loggers sitting like little elves on top of giant logs that are, as big as you've ever seen. He really documented the heyday of that industry, and these black and white photos, are just kind of mind-blowing. They're iconic. And again, the scale of it gives you a sense of just, how much wood we chopped down, how many, how much forest was here that is not here anymore. The only place really that you can see these kinds of forests are in places like Olympic National Park, where there's some areas, the Hoh and others, where these forests still exist in protected status. But it was anything goes back in that era. And these photographs, you see them used as these kind of iconic pictures of the Northwest frontier experience.
Right. There is that famous photograph of some lumberjacks dancing or doing handstands on a...
Oh, yeah. That's the interesting thing. In those early days of photography, people, they would have dances on stumps. But individuals, would do handstands on stumps way in the air. It was kind of a place where you could show off, And there are some great, photographs that kind of capture the sort of fun. And it reminds me of the way that people would pose in front of hunting trophies.
Or fish.
Or fish,
or their
exactly.
90-pound Chinook salmon that they caught.
Exactly. It has this thing of kind of, you're showing off the scale, but there's also this element of conquering the wilderness or conquering the frontier. And people pose their children in front of these things and their pets and that kind of thing. It was almost as if some of these stumps were this, kind of glorious trophy that everyone could gather around, and you'd get these multiple messages in these photographs. It's really quite interesting, and it's amazing how many of these photographs there are. I mean, you look in the collections at the University of Washington, the Kinsey collection, which is at the museum in Whatcom County, the WSU collections. If you just start looking, Washington State Historical Society, you start looking for stump pictures and people posing with stumps, there are just zillions of them. And that kind of blows my mind. It was like a whole TikTok thing before TikTok.
Was there a particular stump house that became the iconic image of what you're talking about, the bountiful forest resources of the Northwest?
Yes, there is. So Kinsey took a picture of a stump house that was near Arlington, and it was a house that was kind of gussied up by the Lindstrom family, Swedish immigrants who had moved west. They put a roof on their stump house. They installed a window, a stove. They used it as a temporary home until they could build a more permanent home. So they actually lived in this thing. And it's just this charming hobbit house. And Kinsey's made a postcard out of it. And suddenly, it was selling like crazy. Other people took pictures of it, and it became sort of the definitive giant potato on the flat car image of, what the abundance of the Northwest forests was here. So, it became this kind of iconic image.
We'll be right back after this message.
Are you nerdy by nature? Do you get thirsty for thinkers? The Crosscut Ideas Festival is returning to Seattle April 29th to May 6th with fresh conversations to quench your curiosity. We'll explore issues and innovations in science, health, equity, and politics, like wokeness in America, spiritual prescriptions for mental health, the heavy hand of the Supreme Court, and the rise of AI. Join Michael Barbaro, Audie Cornish, Eric Holder, Deepak Chopra, Ibram X. Kendi, Andrew Yang, and more. Tickets at crosscut.com/festival.
I know you're a student and a historian of World's Fairs and expos. Did any of the stump houses make it to any World's Fairs?
Well, I came across a couple of things. One is that at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, there was Washington had a pavilion there in which the state was, displaying its natural resources. So, of course, timber was part of that. So they brought what was a huge chunk of a tree, and it was, 10 feet high, 13 and a half feet in diameter, and it could hold 65 people. And they installed this as the exhibit. And they actually had this sort of office for that exhibit was in this stump. And the whole idea was to promote our inexhaustible, in quotes, forests here. Because, in 1900, they looked at these forests, they looked at these trees, and they just imagined they could cut it forever. It would never go away. And then in 1909, as far as I know, this wasn't actually built, but I found a rendering in a newspaper of a stump house that was planned as a showcase at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle. It had a kitchen, porch, living room, fireplace, cedar flooring, of course, and it was one of the things they kind of advertised was it would have the fragrance of pioneer days. But this was like an
nice
upper class,
rustic way to put it.
This thing was designed as kind of like an upper class stump house, and I had never heard about this when I came across this full page, picture and article about what was planned, and when it was true at these various expositions of that period in Seattle and Portland, they built these huge pavilions to showcase the natural resources out of logs that still had the bark on, but they were built almost like cathedrals, with these, multi-stories high and vaulted ceilings, and so essentially they were kind of like stump houses, except they were more like stump Parthenons, and
giant stump lodges.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, if you ever want to see one, there's one at East Glacier. It wasn't a pavilion, but it was designed by a guy who did the pavilion in Portland, I believe. And it's the lodge at East Glacier, and they have bark on pillars, and it really is cathedral-like. It really is like you're in, the Milan Cathedral or something, except it's timber. They had to build special train cars to get the lumber out to Glacier National Park in order to build this lodge.
Are there any stump houses around now, or anything that's been refurbished, reconstructed, but are the remains of a true stump house?
Yeah, well, so the Edgecombe House eventually was dismantled, and then it kind of rotted away, as I understand it. Eventually, nobody put it back together, and it deteriorated. There is a stump house at the museum in Arlington that's outdoors, obviously next to the museum, that was at one location and moved there. I don't think you can go into it, but it's there. And then you see miniature stump houses, the kind of place where in Forks, I've run into a stump house. There might be more than one. That it's more than a telephone booth, and might have something on logging exhibit or whatnot in there. But so you definitely see these kind of small versions, which are still bigger than anything that you would do today. And the Edmonds Museum did an exhibit on stump houses, and they recreated one for that exhibit. This was a few years ago. So, there's still kind of vestigial ones out there, and of course, the one thing that hasn't gone away is this idea of recreating that kind of intimate habitation in the forests. Of course, now we can do them with, tree houses or miniature lodges or, that kind of thing. But there is something about that, desire for that little cabin in the woods that is connected, I think, to the appeal that these things had.
I always had, since I was a boy, fantasies about tree houses that could be in some of these giant trees that, could be as elaborate and large as you wanted them to be.
Right. The Swiss Family Robinson
exactly.
Place at Disneyland, I remember, was like a big deal when I was young. It was like, well, who wouldn't want to live like that?
I was a youngster in the 50s, early 60s, and my family did a lot of hiking. And not only would we see on our travels trucks carrying huge logs, something you don't see today at all. And I'm struck by that every time I see a logging truck go by any place, that the diameter of the trees are just not what they were. But I'm also struck by the fact that it's very rare for somebody to be able to see the kind of trees that used to exist. the very enormous old trees. Where can people go see those?
Well, you pretty much have to go to a national park. I mean, Mount Rainier National Park has, groves of old growth trees that you can walk on a boardwalk to. The oldest, or not the oldest, but the largest cedar tree, I think, in Washington is near Kalaloch on the coast. And there's a road that you can drive down, and you can get to this tree. It's called the Duncan cedar, 170 feet tall, 20 feet in diameter. So this gives you a sense of scale. The tree is, much of it's dead, but it's still, parts of it are still living up top. And it's estimated to be about 1,000 years old. So there's some parks in Vancouver Island have trees of equivalent size. So, there definitely are preserves, in protected territory. It's interesting what you say, because I remember that too as a kid, seeing it's all that, the sort of the Sometimes a Great Notion, the Ken Kesey novel era. You still get some whiffs of that down on the Columbia River out toward Astoria, even if the forests aren't of the scale. But I remember seeing logging trucks in Seattle driving on I-5 in the 60s and 70s with massive old growth logs on them. And of course, back then, as people were becoming more environmentally conscious and beginning to understand that the forests were exhaustible, not inexhaustible. But you don't see that anymore. I mean, it's rare. People can take big trees like that and do off of private land primarily. But with the advent of the environmental movement made it a lot more difficult to endlessly cut timber wherever you wanted to, whenever you wanted, especially on public land, because, we were trying to protect ecosystems. We were trying to protect endangered species like the spotted owl. So things have changed quite a bit, really since the 90s.
What is the largest tree that remains in the Metro Seattle area? Do you know?
I do not know. As far as I know, there's old growth in 3 public parks still. So there's old growth in Seward Park, which was partially cut, but not entirely cut. And those go back, 400 or 500 years, some of them. There's old growth in Schmitz Park in West Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I believe there's some old growth in Carkeek Park. Mm-hmm. Some of those, the last of the old growth that was taken out of Seattle parks was during World War II, where they did some selective timber cutting because of the war and the war effort. I certainly know in Seward Park, these trees are revered. Some of them have been subject to vandalism in recent years. There's one tree in particular which is in a very public place that had a plaque near it, and they took the plaque down because people wanted to, damage the tree.
Can't imagine.
So, yeah, but there are also, places where people have made little altars to some of these trees. We're sort of divided into the tree worshipers and the tree vandals still. But we're one of the few cities where there's old growth within the city. And most of it just survived pretty much by accident.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by Seth Halloran, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. If you'd like to check out more videos from Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. The video series is now in its 7th season. A new episode airs on Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9, every week through May. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the live events we host every month, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of KCTS 9. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Stephen Haig. We'll be back soon with another episode.